recorded.
So this isn't going to be part of the op talk, but I was glad that you brought up the Canadian bread conspiracy in the book. Because I couldn't understand why, and it was even my colleagues, right? Like colleagues in mainstream media making a big deal out of that. I sort of wonder, is like, do people understand how consulting works? This is not, there's a big gap.
Stuff got pretty outlandish. That one in particular, because I remember feeling like understanding that the lack of transparency was about my clients was leading people to fill in the blanks. And so I was so relieved when we could finally explain what I did, because I thought nothing could be more boring than working on grocery prices in Canada, only to discover that this could be the stuff of conspiracy theories.
Right. Yeah. You think disclosure offers more. Generally, right? Like generally it does.
I'd like to think so.
Right.
But it doesn't get you out of the woods.
All right, the counter's still going up, but I might just to make sure we make great use of this time, because I know there's an incredible amount of interest in your book and your thinking right now. And of course, we have a lot to talk about as a country, so we'll get started. And I'll just say welcome to everyone for joining us. I'm Beena Venkatraman. I am the Boston Globe's editorial editor. And this is an event of the Boston Book Festival, and it is also a Globe Op Talk, which are conversations that Globe editorial board members have with exciting thinkers and doers who we think deserve to have their opinions aired and debated and brought to all of you in an exciting virtual format. It's my pleasure and honor to be in conversation today with Pete Buttigieg, who, as you will all know, is a former presidential candidate, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, a fellow Westerner. I'm an Ohioan. And he is also the author of a new book, Trust, America's Best Chance. Right here. I got to spend some time with this week. And so we're going to have a conversation today. At some point, we're going to invite on one of my colleagues who's going to channel some of the great audience questions, advanced reader questions we got, as well as questions that you might put into the Q&A feature during the conversation. So feel free to do that, but know that we were bombarded with questions for Mayor Pete, and so we might not get to all of them, but we're going to do our best. So welcome, Mayor Pete. Thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you, Beena. It's really great to be with you, and really appreciate Globe and Op Talks for hosting the chance to speak today. It's timely.
That indeed. I'm going to start right with news, because we had this extraordinary revelation this week that I think speaks to a lot of the themes that you raise in your book about mistrust of institutions, alienation, conspiracy theories in America, which is that the FBI this plot, a plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, Michigan governor, and to potentially assassinate her. This group of right-wing extremists we know gathered Facebook, had some ideas about the ways in which the governor was violating the Constitution that basically gave them the idea to do this, and they were mobilizing to do this, is what we're understanding, at least from the allegations that were the basis of the investigation. I want to get your take on this, on what's happened, and this sort of shocking, stunning announcement that this group of people had these notions, as well as were planning this actual act of violence.
Yeah, it's extremely disturbing. You know, as I write in the book, there's nothing new about conspiracy theories. There's an American tradition of what's been called the paranoid style in American life that goes all the way back to the time of the founding. But what is new is for there to be this much legitimization of this conspiracy thinking from all the way to the highest office in the land. I don't think you need to use too much imagination to connect the dots between a presidential tweet saying "liberate Michigan" and people like this taking it all the way to the extreme length of the domestic terrorism plot that was uncovered. Similarly, when you had the president last week, which feels like another age, on a presidential debate stage, instructing a white supremacist group to, in his words, stand by. I mean, he doesn't say what they're supposed to stand by for, but I think we all have a sense of what that tone could arouse or evoke. And it's one more reason why we're in extremely vulnerable and dangerous territory as a country. Now, this was an extremist terrorist group. This doesn't reflect the mainstream of the Republican Party or even the majority of people who support President Trump, but it does reflect an attitude and a kind of a suspicion of everything that can have very violent consequences. And it's one more example of what can happen to a society when the basic patterns of social trust and institutional trust that we depend on more than we realize start to erode. It's one of the reasons I wrote this book. And the thing is, these patterns of trust, they actually work best when we don't notice them, when they're working so consistently and solidly that we take them for granted. The idea of a peaceful transfer of power, the idea of a legitimate election, these are all things that we're not even supposed to have to think about or worry about. The moment we do, we're already getting into trouble.
Say more about that. So one of the things we know is that these right-wing extremists gather on Facebook, which we know it has an algorithm that suggests groups to people, groups based on posts that they like, other groups that they're part of. And that's part of the service, or part of what Zuckerberg has talked about Facebook offering to people. Now, you mentioned that conspiracy theories and this kind of skepticism of institutions dates back to our founding. What responsibility do social media companies and platforms like Facebook have for the sort of insidious and undetected way that some of these conspiracy theories grow?
Well, I think they have a lot of responsibility, much more than they've accepted. Although it was interesting to see the breaking news today about Twitter starting to put restrictions on potential political misinformation during the voting season. But these platforms are trying to have it both ways. On one hand, they're saying, hey, we're just the pipes, we're just the message, we're just the bulletin board. We can't be reading what everybody sticks to it. The whole idea of free speech is we just let it go through. And on the other hand, they're making money not just from the volume of information, but in some ways from the quality of misinformation and information that's out there. In other words, the more controversial things are, the more money they make. Now, controversy, even if it's sort of both sides, isn't neutral in terms of the effect that it has on trust. And one of the studies that I looked at in the book had to do with Russian misinformation, but not about the election, something else. There was a study in a journal of public health that looked at Russian troll and bot activity from about 2014 to 2017. So this is before, during, and after the 2016 election. And they specifically zeroed in on what these Russian accounts were saying about vaccines. And what's so interesting is they were pushing out anti-vaccine misinformation and pro-vaccine information at the same time. I think that's very revealing about how doubt and controversy can be created. Just the fact of making that feel like a 50-50 debate in itself served to erode confidence in settled medical knowledge about the virtue of vaccines. But it also just amplified the level of general doubt and institutional mistrust in the country. And I think if you're ever in doubt about how important the role of trust is, a really good piece of evidence for that is just how much energy and attention our adversaries have put into undermining it here at home. That's something that I think we need to continue to be on the lookout for, not just in the obvious venues of things like misinformation about candidates running for office, but more subtle efforts to invent areas of disagreement or to exploit existing sources of very legitimate distrust, like, for example, racism in America, something else that Russian internet activity was very cleverly using as a way to weaken the fabric of this country. And sometimes the only way to address that is to address the underlying cause.
I want to get back to the issue of race, which you raise in the book, but you talked about the business model of the social media platforms being sort of incompatible with trying to contain some of this information from going viral. But you also wrote in the book about Roger Ailes and Fox News. And I know you've been on Fox News in the past few days as a surrogate of the Biden-Harris campaign, making some very powerful and viral statements in response to some of the questions from their opinion anchors. But you raise this interesting point in the book, which is that Roger Ailes essentially created trust in his network, trust for that information, by expressing people's distrust of others, which I thought was just an interesting way of framing that, and important to point out, because we know that Fox News has been a major driver of misinformation. We don't need Russians to tell us misinformation about COVID when we have a major news organization driving and providing a platform for misinformation in the US, which we know has happened during the pandemic. When that business model is so profitable, right? We know that people go to Fox News. We know it's actually a profit-making enterprise in media, and that we don't have the Walter Cronkites.
Right.
We don't necessarily have a strong business model for the Walter Cronkite of the 21st century. How do we actually establish trust in a way where those institutions deserve our trust at a time when these business models basically seem to support also untrustworthy institutions for that?
Yeah, this is hugely important, and this is part of the code that Fox News cracked really beginning in the 90s. The other side of sort of sowing distrust is a way to create a smaller, for lack of a better word, community. This is the odd thing about conspiracy groups too. They actually create a sense of belonging for their own members. Think of the subtext. If I lean into you and confide and say, you can't trust what you're seeing in the media, or trust no one, or they don't want you to know this. When I'm saying trust no one, I'm also in a weird way saying trust me. I'm giving you this little bit of insider information, therefore trust me. And what's happened is people have been pulled into this alternate reality that doesn't have to cohere. It's held together just by a general sense of grievance and accusation and nefariousness about everything else. And those seeds, by the way, are much more likely to sprout and find much more fertile ground in societies where there's a lot of social and or economic inequality. And of course, we have both. It's one of the reasons that, ironically, since conservative ideology is often less identified with low-income people and workers, I actually think that right now, that income inequality is actually helping propel things like the atmosphere that Fox News has created. Now, the only way I can think of to deal with that is to actually go there and offer a different perspective. And I can't blame people for not understanding our perspective if they've literally never seen it, which could be the case if you only get your information from certain sources and I'm not willing to go on them. That's why I go on Fox News as often as I can. That broader question, though, about the economics of this is vitally important, especially because we need reporting and editorial functions more than ever. I think at one point there was a thought that maybe technology would mean we don't need reporters so much. And, you know, in a way, it certainly changed what we need reporters to do. Anybody can get reports from the field, so to speak, just from a smartphone. And yet, we actually need more than ever people to separate fact from fiction and people to help us process the huge amount of raw information that comes our way. But when I was a military intelligence officer, we were trained on the difference between information and intelligence. Raw information being just data points or stories that come your way, and then intelligence being what you make of them, making an assessment, deciding what kind of sense to make any of it. We need journalists more than ever to help us do that. But we can't just expect the media to figure this out. We as citizens, we as consumers of news, need to make some more intentional decisions about what we're rewarding and what we're punishing with our clicks and with our purchases. And unless that changes, we could continue to be in a spiral where we're losing journalism, and in particular, local print journalism is something I worry about, at the exact moment when we need it more than ever.
Thanks for that plug for the Globe, Pete. I appreciate that. But I do want to ask you go back to the issue of race, because in the book, you quote James Baldwin, who is one of the thinkers I most admire as well. And we had a Globe Op Talk actually with Eddie Glaude, who is the Princeton professor who has written this beautiful book as well this year called Begin Again. And what Glaude and really Baldwin contend about America is there's not a good reason to trust in the myth of America. There's not a good reason to trust in the institutions of America, particularly for Black Americans, but you could extend that to other Americans who've been sort of left out of the American contract or left out of the American dream, so to speak. And I just want to get your sort of reaction to that, because I think you do write about, the inherent problems, the systemic racism that have prevented Black people from being able to trust institutions like law enforcement or the criminal justice system. But how do we even claim that there is such a thing as American trust that either existed or could exist. And there are a lot of people who feel that we actually just scrap the institutions or even the founding myths and create new ones.
Well, I think Baldwin is very convincing. It's a great moment for America to be rediscovering what he had to say, because he's making some very common sense points about how he's not able, as a Black man, especially describing the experience of being a Black writer in the 60s and 70s and the things that propelled him to move to Paris. He can't even go about his life because of an inability to trust in the goodwill of institutions and people around him. As he said, this was not paranoia, not something in his mind. It was just drawing conclusions from what he saw everywhere. All of that is true. And at the same time, I don't think that has to defeat our belief in the possibility of trust. One of the most remarkable things, certainly as we look at that period of history, is how Black Americans made America more democratic. Not all the way, obviously. The story of the struggle for equality didn't end with the civil rights movement. But what the civil rights movement achieved was they were under no illusions about the untrustworthiness and the bad faith of many of the institutions they were challenging. And yet they did have a level of faith in the possibility of those institutions to change. And even Baldwin said, I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. So whether we're talking about thinkers like Baldwin, actors like political and activist actors like the civil rights marchers like John Lewis, who I also write about in the book, who took action, it wasn't because they had any kind of naive trust in people and institutions that couldn't be trusted. It's that they trusted themselves, their cause, each other, and most critically, the possibility that if you confronted these institutions with a demand, they could be changed. And we're in a moment like that now too, specifically with regard to racial justice and generally with regard to democracy, where it's not out of a belief that the system works, but rather out of a knowledge that the system's got to be fixed. That paradoxically, we've got to jump in and use those tools it does give Americans to do something about it. And that's what's at stake, certainly in this election, in every election, but also in the possibility of structural reform.
So in arguing that we need more trust and sort of that we've lost trust in a dating way, you point to some of the history of the pseudoscience that claimed that smoking didn't cause or doesn't cause cancer, sort of mid 20th century in the 50s and 60s. And you follow a trajectory of that coinciding with eroding or loss of trust as decades went on. And you sort of draw a link between that and today's sort of denial and misinformation and trust of sort of non-verified science around COVID-19. The fact that we still have a large number of people who, unfortunately, being encouraged by the President of the United States as a vector and source of misinformation, are not wearing masks or not following social distancing rules. But also, you talk about climate change. The fact that we have this established science of climate change, but also there's pseudoscience we all know that's out there that's been feeding this notion that we don't really have a problem here, or that it's not man-made, and or that there's nothing we can do about it. And I guess for you, there's another book I was reading alongside, it's called Calling Bullshit, a little less of an aspirational name, and it's by the evolutionary biology professor, Carl Bergman and Jevin West at the University of Washington. Jevin is a data scientist. And, what they sort of call for is not so much trust, but a form of skepticism that the citizenry needs to have around what kind of information it's getting. And so I guess I just want to put that question to you, because the premise of what we need in this situation is we need trust. We need people to trust these scientists or trust these scientific findings. It's probably hard for people to sort through. How do they know who to trust, what to trust? Can you give a little bit of a sense of why you think it's trust, not skepticism, or trust, not informed ability to parse and sort of sort through what's information and what's disinformation?
So I guess what I'd say is, of course, we need to be smart and skeptical consumers of information, and we need a scientific community to be skeptical. And as citizens, we need to exercise a lot of judgment. But part of why I wanted to draw our attention to trust is nothing works unless there's some level of trust. It's just too much work to verify everything. In fact, as I wrote, the more I thought about the saying "trust but verify," the more I thought it can only be interpreted as a joke, because to trust is not to verify, and to verify is not to trust. If I have to personally verify every time I buy food that it's not going to give me food poisoning, it is not possible to participate in a basic economy that involves grocery stores and restaurants. If you can't trust that I'm going to wait at the red light while you go through the green light, it is not possible to operate a vehicle. And if we can't trust at least some basics about our political and legislative processes, then we can't actually have a functioning government. So the question is, how do we build up enough trust that does some of that work for us, that we can apply our skepticism to the real questions that are most difficult to sort out, and where we think we're getting closer to the truth in a good faith process, where we might have different interests, different values, but we're on the same field of fact. The more you look at it, the more the ability to just trust certain things is what makes it possible for us to get through life. And as that breaks down, we simply don't have the ability as individuals to personally verify everything. It's why we rely on one another to help us establish that we're safe, that certain things are true, and that we can make good choices across that field of fact that we need to be able to count on. And you mentioned COVID and climate. These are good examples where, look, I feel passionate about climate science. It's not like I'm a climate scientist, right? A lot of this depends on my faith in a scientific community and the skepticism that they have exercised on my behalf, going through various claims and advancing knowledge. Same with the decision to get a vaccine. We all, those of us who believe, as most Americans do, that getting vaccinations are important, come to this feeling that our position is well informed, and yet almost none of us are medical experts. We trust those who are, and as that erodes, we get into great physical as well as moral danger.
Though we know that there are people who are trying, studies that have been retracted on the link between vaccines and autism, which we know does not exist and is not something that people should be worried about. They should be more worried about the diseases that come from not vaccinating. But the fact that people place trust in these alternative sources, what do you think this is to that, to helping people build trust in the right kind of institutions, the right kind of sources, so to speak, the scientists who are skeptical, who are evidence-based, journalistic institutions that are looking at evidence and not merely trying to steer ideological thinking?
Well, the more overlaps we have in our experiences with other Americans, the less likely we are to get into these kind of bubbles where we develop not only our own values and opinions, which is fine, but our own understanding of reality. One of the things that really worries me is that we used to have, and still do in many ways, I don't want to be nostalgic about this, overlapping circles of belonging. And often one of the most powerful sources of trust is to belong in a group or a circle with others. And the beauty of being part of a complex community is the way that those circles can overlap. You may not be part of my faith community, but I know you because we're part of a sports team together, and somebody else might not care about the sports that we participate in, but has similar political values, and somebody else might just physically live next to me in a neighborhood, even though we have nothing else in common, but we have that shared experience. And the more there are these kind of chance encounters, and the more there are these kind of collisions of different experiences, the more we notice legitimate challenges to our understanding of the facts, but also a quiet consensus building about what's reasonable and what isn't, what's true and what's not. The problem is those overlapping circles of belonging are starting to become concentric circles. In other words, the faith community I'm part of, the neighborhood that I'm part of, the certain bullet points on my resume, almost make it easy to predict what my politics are going to be, and other things that all kind of group us into clusters. The irony of the digital age is it held the promise of breaking some of that up, and yet because of the way these algorithms concentrate us according to what we want to see, they've actually made us, at the very moment we have access to more people and places and information than ever, in many ways more provincial than we might have been 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's quite an argument for sort of wandering physically and otherwise outside of the realm of where you're being driven by algorithms, right? You're just going to go to those same groups. to get in audience questions in a moment, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, because I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds. You write in the book about the night of the Iowa caucuses, which we know, even though it feels like it was a decade ago. It was just earlier this year, and we know that was quite a challenging night for you, for the country, and having this debacle with the app and not knowing what the confirmed results were. And you were actually the subject of a lot of conspiracy theories about the results as a result of the delay in sort of being able to get the right delegate count and make sure that that was tabulated correctly. We know we're heading into November with a great amount of potential for dispute and delay in election results, if only because of mail-in voting and the fact that ballots will have to be tabulated later, tallied later. What is your sort of thought about what can be done to establish trust in authoritative election results after November 3rd?
This is something we need to be very careful of, because all of us, certainly my side of the aisle, are rightly vigilant about potential attempts to suppress the vote. We're seeing them all over the place. It's why organizations like Fair Fight, founded by Stacey Abrams, and efforts like Democracy Docket, led by Mark Elias, fighting out in court some of these election process questions. It's why all that's so important. At the same time, we also need to make sure we don't allow our elections to be delegitimized by people who just aren't happy with the results, something that President Trump has already made clear he's going to do, because he's said openly that any election he doesn't win is by definition illegitimate. That is incredibly dangerous to our democracy. You know, I'm hoping that the Iowa experience gives me a little bit of standing to try to help prepare the public for the fact that we may not get election results on election night. And if anybody in the country knows the frustration and impatience of not getting same-day election results, I'm right there. But in many places, this could actually be an indication, not of something nefarious, but of people doing their job. You look at Pennsylvania, which, barring some change in procedure, will not be allowed to open any of the early votes or absentee ballots until the day of the election. It's going to take them a while to count all of that. And if that takes a day or two or more, that could be an indication of people doing their job with integrity. The other thing I learned through that experience, because I believe that my campaign was the one most harmed by the delay in the results. After all, for a campaign as improbable as ours to have been able to have officially certified on caucus night that we had in fact won would have really catapulted us into a different position going into the other states. And yet there were people online, everywhere from Donald Trump Jr. to folks in my own party, or on the left anyway, were pushing these theories that my campaign somehow wanted the delay or even caused it. One of the things I learned is that conspiracy theories don't have to make sense to spread. They can get a long way just by asking questions. They don't actually have to answer them, or they can take a couple bits of information and weave them into a big insinuation, and that's more than enough. And we've got to be really smart and really careful, especially if we are led either by nefarious foreign actions or just organically, because of our existing ideologies, to question things that are in fact legitimate. For example, if something happens and it's a little murky on day one, and I'm a strong Democrat and I'm watching it and I see something murky happen that is to the advantage of Republicans, I'm going to want to make sure we really know what happened before we start throwing around accusations. And I'm not sure we can expect the same thing when the reverse is true, but that's all the more reason why in the long run, we just got to fix these rickety processes and institutions so that they're harder to challenge to begin with.
Thank you for that. I'm going to invite my colleague, editorial writer Abdullah Fayyad, to join us now. He is going to moderate and introduce some of the audience questions. Thanks, Abdullah.
Thanks, Pam, and thanks, Mayor, again for doing this. We got a lot of questions today from the audience. Right now, a lot of them are coming in live, but we also got some from before, hundreds of questions. So I'll just start small, and then they'll get harder as we go on. So if you could just start by telling us what your favorite podcast is other than your own.
Oh, wow. I've been getting into this one called S-Town. This is probably, everybody else probably discovered this a couple of years ago, but one of the things about running for president and then not is it's like you're coming out of it, out of being kind of frozen for a little while. So all the shows that people were discovering like a couple of years ago, I'm kind of getting into now. That's one I think is remarkable. And looking forward to digging into more podcasts, although not that there's a lot of spare time, but I feel like I'm catching up to where a lot of folks have been.
Well, actually, so you brought up the campaign. A lot of people wanted to know a lot about your memories from the campaign. One reader in particular wanted to know what your favorite memory from the campaign trail was.
I don't know that I could single out one favorite, but there are a lot of memories that I go back to now that I've had a little bit of distance from it. And, you know, most of them are really human moments. Getting to know a high school student who was not accepted at his high school in New Hampshire, and his parents believed his life was in danger, as so many LGBTQ youth are, but was able to find meaning and purpose and a sense of belonging, activated in some way by getting involved with our campaign. And getting to know that family. You know, it was behind the scenes, not one of the moments that was captured on television, but it just meant a lot to me. Some of the moments that were captured on television, you know, the debates, some of them more than others, some of them shed maybe more heat than light. But what we also saw in those debates was a number of Democrats, sometimes 10 or more at a time, who shared broadly consistent values, making not just the case for ourselves, but a case about where our country ought to go. That if you look back now, even though it was hard to see at the time, lined up so much in terms of the fundamentals of what we believe that it helps explain why, after all the hand-wringing and the fear about the Democratic Party being able to keep it together, we're actually remarkably unified around the Biden-Harris ticket as we go into the final weeks of the campaign. So unified that we're finding it easier to bring independents and some Republicans along with us too, without losing fidelity to our values. Then there were just the odd moments, the goofy moments. You know, I remember getting ready to go on stage at a big rally, and just as I was getting ready to go, there was always this little table. And it had a microphone for me to pick up and maybe a note card of a couple of people I needed to make sure to acknowledge when I got up there before I got into my speech. And it's harder than you think to remember where you are when you go to 3 or 4 states a day. So there'd be a big tape on Sharpie. It would say, you know, you are in Davenport or whatever. I never said I was in the wrong place. I came close once. I was in Las Vegas and I was convinced I was in San Diego, or I might have been in San Diego and I thought I was in Las Vegas. But anyway, I didn't say the wrong thing before I realized where I was. Anyway, we're in that moment, that kind of 30 seconds before I go up, where I'm getting briefed on reminders on who's who and what's where. And an advanced staffer just leaned in and said, "Also, Mayor, just so you know, there's a cow." I was like, "Sorry, what?" Like, "There's a cow." "Well, there's a person in a cow suit, and they're not a security threat, so they can't ask them to leave, but we think they might be here to disrupt the event." And I just remember saying, do we know if it's a right-wing cow or a left-wing cow? And she said, "As of now, no, but if we find out, I'll try to give you a signal." And as I recall, the cow did not intervene, but it was just one of those moments that is par for the course when you're out on the presidential trail.
That's funny. All right, so now getting more to the topic of your book, a lot of people had questions about how to restore trust in government. Now a lot of people are curious what to do with the Supreme Court if Trump is able to confirm, or Republicans are able to confirm, Trump's nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, to the Supreme Court, and what Democrats can do in order to restore faith in the Supreme Court. So one reader wants to ask, you know, quote, "I understand reasons for changing institutions like the Supreme Court, but do you think changes to the Supreme Court would erode trust in it and our judicial system?" You know, you had a plan to reform the Supreme Court. You had a plan to also add justices to the Supreme Court. So how would you go about implementing that plan without eroding public trust in the institution?
So I think a lot of it is simply to make sure it's fair, not about power, but about integrity. You know, the philosopher John Rawls had this idea of the original position, right? So how would we want the rules to work if we didn't yet know what part we were going to be playing? And took it all the way to the level of, if you were in some cosmic state before you were born, and you didn't know if you were going to be born wealthy or poor, if you're going to be born black or white, man or woman, gay or straight, whatever it was, what kind of rules would you create? And that whatever you came up with would probably be a lot fairer than rules organized by people who already have a stake. And I think when we're thinking about institutional design, we should think about it that way. I've long been interested in structural reforms to institutions, including the court, not to benefit our side. The way I'm going to try to benefit my side is to make convincing arguments and win office and legislate accordingly. But when I'm talking about structure, I'm talking about making the structure something everybody can trust. And there are things we could do that would make the court not just about making it bigger or smaller, but making it less political. I mean, how much longer are we willing to go on as a country where every time there's a vacancy on the court, there's a huge ideological death match in the Senate committees? This is not healthy. It's not helping. And in so many ways, it's not fair. Similarly, not just with the courts, but with a lot of our representative bodies. I mean, it's really hard to say we're a democratic country with a straight face if U.S. citizens in, let's say, the District of Columbia, there's a bartender who works at a hotel in the District of Columbia who her problems are just as important as mine. Her citizenship is just as valid as mine. But I get 2 senators and she gets 0. Why? There's no good reason. There's some bad reasons, some political reasons why that's been allowed to persist, but there's no good one. Puerto Rico, if they choose, should be able to get that kind of political representation too. So whether we're talking about gerrymandering, money in politics, the Electoral College, which I think is a huge problem for our legitimacy. I mean, it just gives so many people in so many states a reason, a rather unfortunately convincing reason, to shrug and say, yeah, why should I vote, right? That's terrible for our democracy, and one of many reasons I think we ought to get rid of it. So these structural things, and one thing you could do is you could always set them on a delay. In other words, we institute a structural change, a big one, like a national popular vote. But you put it on a clock where it doesn't kick in for a few years, so we don't actually know which party would benefit the most. It helps bring out why it's fair, and also maybe helps different parties agree to it.
So, on the Supreme Court, should Joe Biden and Kamala Harris win in November, would you be somebody who would advocate to add justices to the court as your plan was before? Would you advocate to them to add justices?
Yeah, I mean, my views haven't changed. I continue to believe we need real reforms. There's a lot of different ways you could do it. And again, my hope is that this wouldn't be viewed as just a liberal project, but that this would be a national conversation about how to depoliticize the courts. But I continue to think that matters.
So on changing views, one reader was curious to know if, much of the campaign happened before the pandemic, and at least almost all of it happened before the public really knew the severity of this pandemic. Now knowing what has happened with the economy, someone wants to know if tying your healthcare plan to, your employer, and how many people lost jobs. Now knowing what we know, would that have changed, or has that changed all your view on your healthcare plan?
Well, I continue to think that it doesn't make a lot of sense for our benefits to be tied to our employers. And if you look at my healthcare plan, it created a way out of that. That's why we had this idea of a public plan that everybody could get in on. Retirement, it's not just healthcare. I mean, retirement, ability to build up sick leave for gig workers, for people who have multiple jobs, for anybody in my generation who's going to wind up changing careers more often than my parents changed job titles. It really doesn't make sense to organize our benefits around a lifelong relationship with a single employer. Now, I continue to think my plan was better because my plan basically held that it's okay to have a private option, and I don't think prohibiting people from having access to a private option really helps. But at the end of the day, I think that any of the things we were talking about on the campaign trail about making sure that we could decouple benefits from employers is vindicated even more by what's happened through the course of the pandemic. I do think some of the views I have had have loosened up a little bit, especially, I'm skeptical about, don't get me wrong, I believe in student debt relief, but I'm skeptical about taking it so far that it winds up in effect actually being the opposite of progressive. It can be a transfer of wealth away from people who didn't go to college toward people who did, who tend to wind up with more money. So I've always believed we should be careful about some of these sweeping proclamations about student debt, even though we do need student debt relief. I think now we should be ready for much more generous approaches to all kinds of debt relief than we were really talking about before the pandemic hit. But also, we just need to make sure life in America is less precarious. That's why just basic ideas around elevating the minimum wage, basic worker protections, and extending both who can organize and how you can organize ought to be at the center of our agenda. And we ought to get more toward what things might have been like a generation or two ago, in the sense that there's no going backwards. But one thing we should recover from a prior age is the idea that these commitments to workers and to workers' ability to organize were once upon a time something Republicans and Democrats agreed on.
So I have two more questions for you because we're running out of time. The first being, if Donald Trump wins re-election, what's your advice to people on what to do and how to move forward as a country?
It's going to be really, really tough to move forward as a country if a president who sends out coded messages to white supremacist groups and denies the legitimacy of his opponents and doesn't seem to have any regard for things like the freedom of the press, manages to retain power. I will be hard at work figuring out a way alongside everybody else to move forward. But honestly, I really do think this is what's on the line. Look, we're not going to get a do-over on climate change. The deadlines are not being set by some political body that you could ask them to shift the deadline. The deadlines are being set by the physical dynamics and the climate of the planet Earth. And those deadlines tell us that we've got roughly 10 years to do things that we just might as a species have the capacity to achieve in 10 years if we start now, or else we're going to see just unconscionable effects. We're not going to get a do-over on some of these questions around our democracy. And if there's not just a defeat of this president, but frankly, a defeat of those who have protected him in Congress, I think that's the only way to have the Republican Party get to a healthier place than it's in right now. A party made up of people, many of whom know better, who need to learn that sticking to their principles would have been a better course of action than hugging the bomb, as they are with the Trump administration. And it's difficult to see how we advance without that political outcome. And I don't think I'm saying that as a partisan. I'm saying that as an American. It's one of the reasons why I'm encouraged to see, for example, former chairs of the Republican National Committee. I mean, we're talking about as a Republican as a Republican can be, right? Someone who's in charge of the Republicans. We have at least two of them now supporting the Biden-Harris ticket. And I think you'll hopefully continue to see this, so that defeat is not a triumph of one party, but a statement about who Americans are.
So the last question we have, before I turn it back to Bina, is a favorite topic of mine, which is the American flag. Under Trump, the American flag symbol has changed for a lot of people, and now people view it as synonymous with Trumpism and hypernationalism, white supremacy, and one of the readers is wondering, what the meaning of the American flag is for you right now, and why the symbolism of the flag is, so versatile, why it changes so much over time, why it means different things for different people.
So I believe in a kind of progressive patriotism. I think one of the solutions to the problem around trust is to create a circle of belonging that's as big as the country itself. But where it really means something to be American, in a sense that motivates us to look out for one another. And for that reason, I refuse to allow the flag to be claimed by one party or one side. In fact, one important kind of broad project, political project I believe in, is recovering a lot of these terms. That's why I talked a lot about values on the campaign trail. I believe in an understanding of a value like freedom that recognizes that freedom encompasses our ability to live a life of our choosing, and encompasses the freedom that comes from, for example, being able to make a living wage. I believe in faith based on an understanding that God doesn't belong to a political party, and faith can lead you to any number of places politically, but at least in the Christian tradition that I belong to, has a lot to do with looking out for the oppressed and the marginalized. I believe in family values, and the importance for me of family values is making sure a same-sex household like mine is included in our broadening definition of what a family can be. I even believe, I got in some trouble for this, but I believe in the idea of a vibrant American heartland that is racially diverse, and that's one of the best things about the middle of the country that gets overlooked in communities like mine, diverse industrial cities in the middle of the Midwest. So these words get thrown around: values, family, faith, heartland, whatever it is. We should not accept the idea that they're going to be shrunken into a form that excludes far too many Americans. And I think that's true with the flag. When I think about the flag, I think about what it was like to have that flag attached to my shoulder when I was deployed into Afghanistan. And the fact that flag, that same flag, was on the shoulder of somebody else sitting next to me in my vehicle, who might be different from me in every possible way that an American can be different. Maybe a different generation from a different part of the country, a different race, maybe a very different political background, but the flag symbolized what we had in common. And it symbolized the idea that we were part of a shared national project. We're going to need to recover that more than ever. And for that very reason, cannot allow it to be appropriated like it only belongs to people of a certain race, or people of a certain political persuasion, or any other kind of person besides all of us who view ourselves as belonging to America.
All right, well, thanks so much for answering these audience questions. And Bina, I'll pass it back to you. Thanks, Mayor.
What's up, Bella? Pete, do you have time for one more question? I know we're over the time we said. So I do want to ask you about the solutions to this, because you did talk about inequality and the need to address inequality as a way of restoring trust in institutions. And what you just said indeed was about sort of how do you reclaim American values and define what they are. But you write in the book also about service. And of course, you served in the Navy, but you write about other forms of service, including Peace Corps and AmeriCorps. And I'd like to know, first, can you explain a little bit more about how you think service can restore trust, and what you would do if you were in a Biden-Harris administration to actually institute that?
Well, having had the experience of trusting my life to people I barely knew when I was in the military, I've thought a lot about the way that service can be part of the answer. And I don't mean, look, the military is not for everybody. The question is, how do you get people to have that same experience of building trust without necessarily having to go to war in order to get it? And that's why I'm a big believer in a national vision for voluntary civilian opportunities to serve. There's so many Americans who would participate in the service program if it were available, and fully funded and paid, so that this was not just a luxury for the well-off. And there's plenty of work waiting to be done. But even more important than the work to be done is the experience of forming those connections and bonds that can happen in a service effort. And I'm definitely going to be making the case for that in the years to come, whether it's from within or outside of an administration. I also think it provides a metaphor, though. You think about how people for example, deployment situations form trust in a hurry. A lot of it actually comes before they get to know each other well. That trust is established for the simple reason that you have to. You have to trust people with your life in order to get the job done. And that, I think, is a metaphor for where we are as a country, where we are in the world. There is the same level of urgency, crisis, and danger all around us. We could respond to that by turning against each other, or as I outline in the book, there are ways that we can respond to that by depending on each other more and building up the kind of trust that will make it possible to cooperate.
Thank you so much, Pete Buttigieg, for joining us for this Op Talk and Boston Book Festival event. Would be remiss if I didn't tell everyone listening that you can purchase this book, Trust, at the Harvard Bookstore for $16. Great independent bookstore here in Greater Boston. And I also want to just thank everyone for joining us and let you know that if you like this Op Talk, we have more coming. We have one on Tuesday with Eric Lander, the principal leader of the Human Genome Project and president of the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, former Obama science advisor, about trust in science. So building on this theme, we'll be talking at 1 p.m. on Tuesday. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you for hosting.